have a really, really great answer to. Engage. You were sent a 1AC through 2NC document that has what will be used as the inspiration for this conversation. You have Sean and Ben for an hour. They will go back and forth about how to substantively understand, unpack a critical affirmative, how to engage that critical affirmative. They might even be critical of the documents that you sent, that we sent to you, just to show how debates are dense and deeper, and it helps aid in whatever side of the argument that you're on. To be quite honest, a lot of y'all lean affirmative, and that's okay with my heart, but I'm also okay for maybe my framework folks in there. My issue is there's never an engagement. This is your opportunity to learn what are the crucial areas. So don't think of this as a lecture. They're here to work the debate out in front of you and provide what they think, also from like a coach and judge perspective, the best nuances to this, but more specifically for y'all to throw in your questions. Do not, like, this is not a space to be afraid of questions. Like, confused face, weird time to not be like, wait, 1 second. But what if I said this? What if this was my argument? Because you have the same affirmative that they're dealing with, or the same 1NC, you've been affirmative versus framework. And we're trying to progress and move forward. And so we have those questions and trying to break those thresholds. This is your time. We are open to all of that. And so sorry, Caitlin. Caitlin, also big important person who'll be doing a lot of the SPAR stuff at the end of this, where you'll get to engage more of the argumentation. Caitlin is now an assistant coach at Wake Forest, debated for the University of Michigan, was a semifinalist of the NDT, also octa-finalist of the 2019 NDT. So real smart, real flex, real policy, real critical too. Just really, awesome all around debater, coach, and mentor, and also as exec operations for Debate Boutique. So I'm super excited for her to iron out your critical affirmatives today with these SPARs. So I'm done talking. I'm gonna throw the mic over to Ben and Sean. Please, y'all. This workshop is as effective as you allow for it with your questions and just eager mind to engage, grow, and understand these debates. So that's all I got.
We want to start with 1AC stuff, Ben?
Sure. Oh, you want me to start? Sure, I can start.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Sure. Well, first, I want to say it's delightful to meet all of you all digitally, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I just told Jasmine, Sean, and Caitlin that I've been in PF land for about 3 months now, and I have not heard the word anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, plantation, whiteness, white supremacy in a very long time. So I am thrilled to be part of this conversation. I think the goal today is for us to have a conversation with you all about the affirmative and the negative, and just talk about what we see as a potential in both of these strategies, ways to improve them, as well as kind of some of the shortcomings. And we're going to start with the affirmative first. We're just going to talk generally about different parts. If you have something you want to contribute when it's my turn, and I assume same for Sean, just either, I guess, is it okay if I use a reaction or either raise your hand or get our attention or something so we can know to let you speak? But let's get started. When I start reading this affirmative, the first thing that jumps out to me is the kind of persona or embodiment I think that's needed to probably perform such an act to its full effect. That does not mean that everyone does not have access or can't read an affirmative, because anyone can read any affirmative, obviously, but the weight of having a discussion of the way that Black women's bodies and as we continue to look, other bodies, indigenous bodies, dispossessed bodies, are affected by political interaction, and the expectation that comes along with that political interaction is very interesting in this particular affirmative. So I want to kind of focus on one thing that I think, if you read this affirmative, you should definitely make sure that you talk about and make sure you understand and grasp, and even, I guess, make sure you have an ability to explain. I want to talk about colonial visuality first as a concept. So we know when we're reading through it that it's a discussion of how history allows for us to erase violence that happens onto certain bodies in certain ways. Well, in debate, when you have any type of theory that begins to contextualize how power operates or how power moves in political spaces, you need to make sure that you understand that in, I would say, at least 3 different contexts. The first context is, how does that operate globally? So is it a kind of macro, is it a structural form of violence that operates? And I think I would say colonial visuality reaches that level. The second one is, how does it operate locally? So when we talk about U.S. politics, how have we seen this how have we seen it enacted specifically in the context of the topic, or more generally in the context of the conversation that you want to have? And the third one, which is probably the place that is most lost in this debate, is the interpersonal, or in the person-to-person connection of how power will operate and how that violence constitutes itself in debate rounds. You have said in your first speech that debate in and of itself is a microcosm of failed alliances with Black people, that the world has failed in being able to maintain its relationship with Blackness. If that's true, what has the people in the debate done to also violate that initial law before they even speak, right? How do they operate, right? If the natural belief is that T is the natural response to a plan without an A, how is that any different than a natural response of fear or perch clutching in an elevator with a Black person? How is it not the same response? And when you begin to understand those 3 levels and those examples in that way, I think when you analogize them, debates become so much easier, because you can identify behavioral patterns or characteristics that exist based on, again, what your AFF says, their relationality to Blackness. And I think that as colonial visuality would be the first example. Sean.
Also want to say thank you, Jasmine and Caitlin, for having me here too. And great to meet all of you. Really excited to be doing this workshop. This is super awesome. Yeah, so like kind of jumping off from what Ben just said, which I totally agree with. The thing that jumps out to me, if we start with colonial visuality, is I'm a rhetorician, so I like to think in terms of metaphors and just like the language people are using. So for me, a big metaphor in here that gets at that interpersonal, that connects all those 3 scales of violence together, is alliances. And what is an alliance? Both as like a macro thing that like the U.S. federal government engages in an alliance agreement with NATO or South Korea or whoever, but also as like a micro level thing, in the sense that college debate at some level as a community involves agreements or disagreements about how burdens and obligations and responsibilities should be distributed. So to me, one of the ways of taking something that's very complicated and textured, like colonial visuality, that this I think does really well, and making it something that is easy to kind of play with in a textual sense, is this metaphor of alliances. And that metaphor is so interesting and rich because it's also obviously the language in the college debate resolution as well, right? So what you're saying about alliances is not just, it's not just getting at interpersonal relationships in debate, and it's not just talking about some abstract thing the USFG does. It's also getting at what the topic is and what it is you're even debating about in the first place. So the part about this AFF that's, that I think, in addition to needing a certain ethos and in addition to thinking out the colonial visuality part, the part that you want to be thinking about is it's kind of like those dolls that nest inside of each other, if you know what I mean. There's like the really little one inside and the bigger ones scale up. That like at each scale, like it's the same doll, but it's like it operates at a bunch of different levels, if that makes sense. So the same questions about responsibility, obligation, who is agreeing or who is allowed to agree, or what are the terms of consent for an agreement? Like those questions are raised at every level of alliance. And that gets back to questions of colonial visuality, which I think they overcode some of those alliances. So if alliances, if relationships involve colonial visuality, then alliances don't happen on equal terms. And so I think this affirmative is asking, like, what are the relationships of violence that are involved when any kind of alliance or agreement is made between people, either at a macro political level or at a person-to-person level? And it's saying that those agreements are not worked out, I think, in a way that's voluntary. that's consensual between two parties that have equal ability to determine the terms of the negotiation, so to speak. So to me, that part really stands out because I think that gets at both what's going on with the topic and what's going on in the debate itself and what the community looks like. And that's a really important question. And then the last, I think it's the last card in the 1AC that talks about friendship, which I found this card to be really interesting. It also gets at questions which obviously are going to come up in a lot of debates, depending on the positionality you're reading it from, but questions about what does allyship look like, or what does coalitional politics look like? Can those things be useful? In what contexts are they useful? And what are the terms of negotiation that have to happen for there to be allyship that doesn't simply reduce to repetition of colonial visuality or repetition of hierarchy? Is there a way to have an alliance that isn't a broken alliance, so to speak? Ben, let me kick that back to you.
Yeah, so I have moments of they wouldn't be called flinches, they would be like unflinches, where I just feel like the move of allyship is a continuation of alliance and probably sustains debate, which is counterintuitive to what the AF actually asks us to do. But that's a whole different conversation, and we're not there yet, so I'm going to wait. On the question of friendship and radicalness, I'll say, I think the way that I kind of view this, or the explanation I kind of view this closest to, is probably like a bell hooks synopsis of how we should attempt to engage and create relationality through education, through teaching. And I think there's an I don't want to spend too much time talking about friendship as much as I want to spend time talking about the other part of the app that I thought was interesting, which is the question of like successful versus successful academic. Like, what does it mean for you all in spaces struggling with this information or the message, whatever it is you're trying to share? What does it mean? What responsibility do you have, right? Is this just a game that you can say whatever you want? Or do the conversations that you have in classrooms, that you have digitally online, have material impacts? Do they actually change the way people think? Do they actually engage people? Do they bring people into a conversation they're not normally a part of? Because the idea that somehow, you getting to debate is what really saves you. That's what's going to save you from experience whatever bad thing is. That's what the status quo would say, about somebody deciding to write literature for any specific group, that the university, the academy is what saves them. It drives us to fit in the same model for how we interact on information. And I think that the same way Sean just said that alliances matter because of the rhetorical connection between an alliance and how we think about that alliance or its relationship to power is definitely true in the context of how you all hold people accountable for how they engage in particular apparatuses, whether that's an educational apparatus, so like a school or a university. What is the expectation that they have for how they're going to go about navigating and learning things and engaging different discussions? So I thought that part, I think that you should really, if you're going to read this position, you should really make sure that you're ready to deal with the kind of classroom performance argument that exists. The classroom performance argument that exists inherent with the kind of successful academic university industrial complex argument that's in the 1AC, that I think is much more consistent with an idea that would say we do not actually need a telos for this particular argument. That is something that diverges from destruction, right? Which gets you out of a lot of the whole, how do you prove you do anything? But we'll get to that. We'll get to that stuff later.
Well, and to the last, I going from that point, which I agree with, the really interesting question, the last really interesting question is when you're thinking about this 1AC. So, there's this question of what does success for the affirmative look like? And is, like you said, is success the same thing as success as it's measured from the perspective of, a university admissions committee or a university tenure committee or whoever? Or is it some other kind of success? Like it's achieving it has some other goal in there, some other political goal. And to me, that's important because it really informs a lot of what this 1AC does or does not want to say in the 2AC to framework. So if the idea is that the current form of debate is just like wholesale a broken alliance that relies on colonial visuality and relies on capture of blackness, and at the same time disavows that, and if it is just at some level nothing but that, then it seems like the AF wants to say that form of debate is bad fundamentally, and the form of social relations based on that form of debate are bad. Just like interpersonally, people that have that idea of debate in their head like act badly towards other people, particularly non-Black people towards Black folks. In that world, in the 2AC answering T, one of the things you have to have in your head that you sometimes, it's easy to fall back into, is that arguments that are like, the AF actually is predictable, the AF is like better for the negative, there's lots of things that you can say. You have to be careful at some level that what you are saying is not, here's why the affirmative achieves the sort of like academic version of success. Like, here's why the affirmative sustains the model of debate that you're criticizing, if that makes sense. Because part of what it seems like this 1AC wants to say is that that model of debate's bad. So you don't need those 2AC arguments that you maybe have seen in speech documents or heard at debate camps or seen on live streams where people say, oh, well, we're better for limits anyway, despite reading a critical affirmative. Because if you say those things, you may be trying to sustain the alliance in some way. You may be saying, well, the alliance is, it's in bad shape, but it's not broken. Like, it can still be saved, if that makes sense. So that's one of the things you want to be thinking about is, what is the relationship between what you are saying about alliances and visuality and interpersonal space in the 1AC, and what is the way that you are performing in cross-ex and in your 2AC that approach to alliances and visuality. Because if inconsistencies in those things can either make it easier for the negative to go for framework or easier for you to lose on you link to yourself, if that makes sense. So those are things to be thinking about as you're doing this. And like, that's the power of an affirmative like this, that realizes connections between the macro political and the like smallest, most everyday thing. I will stop talking in just 1 second. We get to that question. The power of that kind of affirmative is that it allows everything to be a part of the conversation, but the risk of it is that everything's a part of the conversation. All scales are coming together at the same time. So you got to be careful with what you're doing.
What's the question say?
I have a question. I want to know, this is a very interesting question. The AF stance on why friendship is distinct from other forms of allyship. What would the response be to an argument that friendship is a recreation of alliances in the debate community?
I told y'all that friendship argument was
dangerous. That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Ooh, I'm gonna have to read it again if I can answer that, to be honest with you, because I feel kind of the same. I feel like the story, right, in the evidence is like, I had an experience where this white guy said something to me that was racist, and this other person stepped in and corrected him. This other person happened to be a non-Black person, right? And we need more people that are willing to put their lives or their bodies, so to speak, in the way to disrupt the current narrative that exists that kind of overshadows or maintains colonial violence. I think that's the purpose of the piece of evidence. Does it get there? That's the debate. It's probably what we need to have. Now, I would say the natural response to the recreation of alliances in the debate community assumes first the pre-existing kind of condition for the alliance, which was around a discussion of USFG. The affirmative moves that focus away from USFG discussion, away from a discussion on the kind of, inevitability of existence of the United States, and says instead, how do we move politically in a way that gets us to the common goal that we've set? Common goal being end of the world again. End of the world being destruction of, anti-Blackness, I guess, which is not really what the AF would do, but you get what I'm saying. I think that's the answer to the question. Sean, do you want to?
No,
there may be something else. I don't know.
I totally agree. I think I would say in response to that question, well, the debate alliances right now are sutured around things like practices of colonial visuality that say things like debate is a game. So we, like you said earlier, Ben, so we can say whatever we want. It's all a question of fairness between the two sides. The primary goals are competition. The USFG is like a neutral starting point for conversation. So you're saying like, we're saying all of that's bad. That's all wrong. We don't agree with any of that. That form of alliance is bad. Now we can have friendship if we agree in, we agree that decolonial politics and abolitionist politics are the purpose of debate. If we agree on that as the starting point for the debate, and you, negative team, agree that the resolution is not the starting point, this sort of decolonial friendship is the starting point for the debate, well then then we can have an alliance, but we can't unless we have an agreement about that.
There is, Jasmine added a thought.
Please.
Black women in consent was a feature to the construction of the act. So what Sean is saying right now, I wanted to add an argument onto that was actually going to highlight the Black women portion of the affirmative, which is, I've talked about performance and holding your opponents accountable. That also includes what you do in your first speech. The reading of this 1AC in and of itself is not simply a performance of a 1AC. It opens with saying that we are a negation of the alliance that exists now. It is clearly an argument for consent, like Jasmine said, because I'm not going to take credit. That is obviously Jasmine's argument. But that is one way that you can tie your performance that happens in the 1AC to a completely different reiteration, re-explanation of why you have reconstituted what friendship or allyship means in the context of the 1AC.
And I think to further on that point and the point that Jasmine made, which I think is really important, King, I mean, and to answer your question really quickly, King is also saying, this is the card that starts with the tag reforming debate and rehabbing the resolution isn't sufficient, and reforming is in quotes, says like, well, I'm not saying explicitly, I'm not saying that there is like no point to white people being involved in Black studies. What I'm saying is that you have to invite chaos and unbecoming of your subjectivity first. And that, I think for King, to Jasmine's point, requires the consent of those who you're engaging with. But if you have that consent and if you're willing to engage in that unbecoming, then that's a different form of alliance than is an alliance that's predicated on, you know, competition, fairness, blah, 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 blah. You got more questions. Whoa,
Yeah.
This is great. I love this. This is great.
I think it's Kiera. Is it Kiera? Is that your name? Kiara? Okay. It says, referring back to the last question, it intrigued me a lot in terms of conceptualizing friendship and engagement. So in the context of the AFF/performance, how is the parameters for a friendship set, or what? What's the litmus threshold of defining friendship and who can be included?
If I could help dispel some of the mystery around the 1AC, just because I think it'll help guide these questions. It was written by Jasmine and I to reflect our friendship about like what it's like to have a relationship between a Black woman and a non-Black woman, and kind of what those look like in alliance politics and debate. So like, hopefully that helps answer the questions a little bit. So it was about a very specific relationship performance that happened.
I don't think I can answer that question for you. I think that you have to determine what parameters you get to set, which is a unique thing that's good. I think this also grants the negative specific arguments because they can critique your metric, which is a unique way for you being like, well, I give you ground specifically on the method that we use. But I would say, generally speaking, I would hope that your first requirement, as Sean has said and as Jasmine has alluded to, and I think even Caitlin just kind of alluded to as well, is consent. I think consent probably has to be the first parameter that you set in order to say you are willing to be in an allyship or a friendship with another person for whatever reason you choose to be. The rest of it, I don't know if it has to be specific, but I also think the idea that you have to provide a set parameter probably links more to the idea of like a successful academic, what it means to be a good debater, what it means to fit into the good model of being able to describe them. Think of it this way. If I'm telling you that I want to kind of end the reality as we know it, and your only concern is how will I do it, that's generally because you don't actually want me to do it. You're thinking of how that will affect you more than you're thinking about how it alleviates pain from all the people that have it, right?
Yeah.
So don't ask me how I do it. Who cares what the steps are? Why does the steps matter? Steps are an excuse for white anxiety. That's it. That's literally why they want them, because they want to absolve the fears they have that they'll lose their stuff, right? They still want Starbucks. And don't get me wrong, some people like Starbucks. My wife loves Starbucks. I'm not a huge coffee drinker, but they still want their Starbucks and their SUVs and their Netflix and chills, you know? And we say we don't want those things no more. Those things cause anxiety. The ability for you to have that is problematic, right? So when they ask you, well, how do you determine who's friends? Well, that question lets me know you're not. How about that? Flip it back on them. That's that. And then I think, sorry, Sean. Last thing, point that out as a form of counterinsurgency too, which we should talk about, because I don't think it technically has an impact in the 1AC or in the 2AC, but I could be wrong. I don't know. Go ahead, Sean.
Well, I was just going to say, Aster actually made a version of this point as well in the chat. Wouldn't friendship be on the more individual debater level instead of an alliance assumed and associated with the community writ large? If the AFF is saying the assumed alliance is anti-Black, then wouldn't it be up to the individual debaters to set the standards that fit their vision of friendship best? And I think that's a really good answer. Yeah, I think that's right. For me as a judge, listening to that answer in the cross-ex, I would be nodding to that. Like, yeah, that seems right. I can see the difference. And that's what y'all are doing there that's really smart, is saying, now we said before that this stuff, colonial visuality and alliances, operate at these different scales simultaneously, but that doesn't mean that they're the same at every level, right? So there can be an alliance between people as friends that's very different than an alliance for a community, because a community-wide alliance with lots of people involved, you know, you have to negotiate some stuff and it gets a little more complicated the more people are in the room. When it's just a couple of people, you can figure things out for yourselves on a person-to-person basis. And that can be part of your argument, that friendship is person-to-person, and at a community level, that's a whole different ballgame. Now we got a whole different set of issues we got to worry about.
Are we cool with shifting in maybe some strategy stuff real quick? We don't have much time left. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Number one suggestion I have for strategy is, I feel most people that read from an AF perspective, I'll start first. The AF, a serious, or at least use your AF, people, I guess is the easiest way to say it. Most people read amazing evidence in the 1AC that has a lot of arguments, and then you don't see those arguments used enough in their following speeches, right? In a debate, if you know it's going to be a framework debate, you have to use your evidence. And I think it's important for kind of three reasons. The first one is history matters. If you understand the history of the arguments you're making, when they are making generic debate theory arguments, you can provide either analogies or direct examples of how this is played out in the past for insert your group of choice, right? Black folks, indigenous folks, queer folks, whoever it is that you are kind of like, whoever the AF is about, you can do that from a historical point and analogize it. The second one is, you have to know the before and after of your evidence too. So when we say use your evidence, don't just read the highlighted parts or the underlined parts or the box parts that are in the cards. Don't skip over the small reading. Read the full text of your evidence. Chances are, if your evidence is talking about alliances and it's written in the context of anti-Blackness, it's going to have specific stuff that may not be in the underlying part, because although it's great historical information, it lacks rhetorical power. You need those historical examples in later times, so make sure you use it and read it all. The last one is, make sure in the 2AC you use familiar language. I can't stress this part enough. Several judges may judge a bunch of class debates, but unless they actually read the literature, saying something as simple as the pathology of whiteness has way more, and I'm sorry I used your example as like that, but it's a good chance you will have judges that have no idea what that means. All they heard you say was that white people are bad. I mean, to be honest, that's what they're going to hear. Yeah. And if that's what they hear, they miss what your argument is, which means all of your examples and framework of how they continue to pathologize, are participating in a system that in particular is anti-Black, they miss. They can't understand that, right? Conceptually. That's exactly, you know, what we, I want to talk about Wahili, but I'm gonna wait. Sean, go ahead. That's my first one. Please use your app. Use all the evidence in your app. Most people don't do it. You don't have to read a ton more new pieces of evidence in the 2AC. You probably have everything you need in the 1AC.
I strongly agree with that. Strongly agree that people read way too many cards in the 2AC. And in line with that, not to be, this 2AC has some really good moments in it, and it has some moments that I think I would not coach a team to use. And I think it fits with kind of with what Ben is saying. One of the issues is that you have to ask yourself, what am I doing with the various pieces of the 2AC? So this Gian Petruzzi card that we are taking from the topic paper, what are the politics and the stakes of citing the topic paper and saying you are an example? Yeah, absolutely. I think this is like actually a really good example of what a 2AC would look like for this app. I basically judged this exact same sort of 2AC at Kentucky. But the thing you want to be careful of with this affirmative, we just had this long conversation about, well, okay, the 1AC's got all this stuff with alliances. It's thought through the relationship between the debate community and blackness/indigeneity in the context of King. You maybe want to be careful about saying we are citing from the topic paper, because if you're doing that, then aren't you reinvesting in the alliance? If that makes sense. So if you're affirmative, I'm a big believer, both when coaching and judging topicality and framework debates against AFs that are not really that interested in meeting the topic. Don't spend so much time worrying about you meeting the topic. Does that make sense? Like, that's not what you set out to do anyway. That's fine. Just be comfortable with the fact that what you are doing is not trying to say that you are better for limits. Because that's not important. Your whole affirmative said that who cares? And I think you got to double down on that, or you're gonna struggle a little bit.
I agree with that statement 100%. I was just thinking about it when you was mentioning. I was like, yeah, like our argument has never been like the 1AC makes the argument the game is bad. Just embrace that you are saying the game is bad. And every time they say, no, it's not, it's good, because it teaches us an iterative process. Yeah. Okay.
Really quickly before we
play
get to
chess.
Really quickly before we get to the question, which I think is a really good one. Like the best example of this is like, people will be like, well, we put our AF on the wiki, so it's predictable. First of all, your whole AF said that colonial visuality was bad. So be careful about saying, hey, don't worry, we put our stuff everywhere. It's like, it's up on every wiki. Well, like, okay, well, that's a little, maybe you don't have to worry about that. And second of all, what is that going to get you by the end of the debate? Really, it's on the wiki. The other team's going to still say, well, it's still hard to debate or whatever. And at the end of the day, that's not really the point that you want to be making in your 2AR anyway. At the end of the 2AR, you want to be like, who cares? We don't care about meeting the topic. We don't even care about the topic is written. And that the topic itself is sustaining this alliance that we object to at a fundamental level, right? And if that's what the affirmative says, which I think in this case that's what it does say, that's fine. Just make that the 2AR. Don't worry so much about these, people have been reading this app for years kind of answer. I don't think that really gets you as far as just really going back to what your 1AC said. This is a great question. In the context of anti-blackness womanism as a K AFF, how would any of you suggest explaining abolitionist politics as the best form of debate? More so, how can we explain metaphorically how a K AFF will eventually lead to visual decolonization? That's a really good question. It's a really heavy question.
Do you want to go, Sean? Do you want to take this one?
Well, so really quickly, what I would say about maybe to take the second part first, how can you explain metaphorically how a K AFF will eventually lead to visual decolonization? I think part of it is saying, and see, this is, okay, so common metaphor, again, I'm a rhetoric guy, so I like to work with what metaphors, is vision of the topic. What's your vision of the topic, affirmative? And I think part of what you can say is like, no, what our affirmative says is that like the vision of the topic is the problem in the first place at some level, that it's too much about having a way of seeing the topic, having it be territorially bound, having a sense in advance of what all the debates should be like and who, what a respectable strategy on that topic would be like versus a strategy that's normatively considered not respectable. Like that vision for the topic is itself part of the problem, and that part of what the AF is doing, at least in one way of reading it, it obviously isn't the only way to do it, but is abandoning the idea of vision for the topic and saying there has to be a more fundamental set of questions that get asked about like interpersonal relationships, about reading practices and debate, about how we understand flesh. And I think the second King 19 card talks about sensuality, pores, those sorts of things. Like those need to be central questions of the topic. So part of the visual coloniality thing to me, or decoloniality in this case, how the AF solves that is precisely by not being topical and by not having a counter vision of the topic. So like instead of sort of giving into the reflex to say, well, we have to have a counter interpretation of the resolution, say we don't have a counter interpretation of the resolution because we think visions of the topic are bad. That visions of the topic reproduce colonial visuality. And that's the whole problem in the first place, is that before we even have the first debate on the topic or cut our first card, people think they know what the topic is supposed to be about already. That's one answer at least.
I'm going to attempt to answer this question. So Tatiana, did I say that right? Tatiana, is that your name, right? Okay, I assume she's here. I just don't want to answer it and you're not here. So, okay. So your 1AC makes a claim about how Black women exist in the world and how that existence is something that's often forced onto them. That the luxury of choice is not something that necessarily exists in the context of Black women through history and a political context. The question of how do we begin to really understand visual decolonization, and we got to unpack, because first, it assumes that there is a right way to be able to understand it, which the 1AC has indicated that the right way, the successful way, often is anti-Black. Two, it assumes that the process of decolonization has an endpoint. Everyone's going to think this way, and now the world is better. 1AC never makes that claim, right? But to answer your question, the way you would explain that is to say that the 1AC puts forward a pedagogy or a praxis of how we engage the world for this particular conversation. That conversation can be about Black women in the context of alliances or any other context you want it to be. The reason why you saw visual decolonization is not because you read the 1AC. It's because whether or not people want to admit it, you create affect through the reading of the 1AC. Mm-hmm. That if one person decides that they think your 1AC is interesting or good, and they do research on it, and they come to the decision themselves that they too believe that the world is problematic, that it is anti-Black, that is solvency. When you're in elimination rounds and everyone watches you debate because they want to know how you're going to explain your argument, that is solvency. Both of those are examples. Bodies gravitate to locations to receive information. That's just how we operate, right? So your visual decolonization is people wanting to watch you debate because it's not because they want to see you win. Not most people. You'll have your crew that want to see you win. I got you. Everybody else is watching you because they want to beat you, which means you've challenged them to rethink about the particular conversation you're going to have, which proves your process of decolonization. Because colonization does not have to be that anti-Blackness ceases to exist, or that, we have returned the land back to Turtle Island. It doesn't mean all of those things because you haven't said it means those things. What you said instead is that you present a counter kind of narrative, a counter visual epistemology to understand how violence operates in this world. And as long as they get that or think they understand your ass, they will struggle with that process of decolonization internally. Oh, that's long. Uh,
Mhm.
I don't know where. Okay, wait. Question. It says, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses. I cannot read what's on my screen.
Would
It's,
decolonization also entail disengaging with the squo? So simply reading the AFT and engaging with the performance of the AFT, not being automatically or friendly or courteous to your opponents under the assumed alliance of the debate space, essentially outlining the AFT isn't cool with debate, is an act of decolonization that is already solvency within the debate space. Could be. That's an interesting theory.
I would like to challenge your not being automatically friendly or courteous part. And the only reason why is because you're automatically going to be scripted as an angry black person, regardless of what you do in the debate, right? The argument you've made instead, or the presupposition you've made, is that if we go into the round and we do these things that they already think we're going to do, then it proves that we are somehow we've decolonized. I don't know. I think that I think that probably proves that you've adopted the same sort of politic that they would take, which is kind of a divide and just overwhelmed with force mentality, which is probably counterproductive to the example. I don't think you have to do a bunch of tricky stuff. I think you just have to say that we've identified an alternative path for understanding how violence operates, and we move in that direction. And the process of decolonization is simply the people that hear our argument, that think about it, that research it, that work to answer it. All of those things prove that we are decolonizing. They are actively working to understand and challenge our position, right? People aren't reading up on this app because they want to say decolonization is not real. This is not a global warming debate. Every time someone reads more about your app, you decolonize, right? You help them through that process because they have to think through, what does it mean to understand genocide from an indigenous perspective? What does it mean to understand slavery and plantational politics through the eyes of a slave? They can't think through that stuff actively and not deal with some internal, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the contradictions thing. I forgot. I can't remember. There's some communication term. I forgot what it's called. Cognitive dissonance. They can't deal with that cognitive dissonance, right? They don't want to. The funniest thing, have you all seen these shows? I'm sorry, I don't mean to get distracted. Have you seen these shows where it's like they get famous white people on TV and they're like, let's do your family tree. And every time the white people be like, y'all, with my family owned slaves, didn't they? God, I knew, man, please don't tell us, right? They don't want to deal with that. That's what doing all this history makes you do. It makes you come face to face with that. Except you have to do it in a debate round with someone who's speaking a lot of words very quickly at you and respond in a way that don't seem racist. Sorry, your life is hard for 3 seconds. Anyway, can I further explain? Is that what that says?
Yeah, you got it.
Further explain this? Further explain what?
I think they sent that initially when you were making the point about cross-ex and being automatically friendly or not in the debate and the relationship to
Got you.
pathology.
So fill me on this. So check this out. Let's say the example is performance matters when you're in a debate, right? If someone's debating you and they know you read black stuff, let's just be honest, that's probably how they described it. Black stuff, right? You read black stuff, they're automatically going to think you're going to be mean and not want to hear anything they got to say anyway. Well, they're just going to call me racist for 45 minutes. I don't want to debate them. That's the conversation that happens in the team room before they come into your room. All right? If that's what they're already saying, that's how they're already going to treat you. Right? There's always an evolution of how militant debaters are when they start reading the K. Like, I can tell what year you are and how long you've been doing it. Because when you first start, everybody got something to prove. No, they're not going. You're just not going to talk to me disrespectful like that. When somebody's been doing it for a couple of years, they've won for a while. You let these folks act like they ain't got no sense. Come on, just let them do it. Sit back. They're gonna act out of pocket. They're gonna do the stuff that you already know they do in private, in public, right? They're gonna do it anyway, but they sneakier with it. You have to be better at identifying. So I don't think being mean to them is what it means to be not friendly, is all I'm saying. So when my example to you was just to say, remember, being mean to somebody in a debate may not get you the win. See, because a lot of times that can turn off judges. You realize you're debating more than just the people on the other team. You have to debate against all of the experiences that judge has had in debate, their students have had in debate, their partners may have had in debate. And if they and all skin folk ain't your kin folk either, is all I'm gonna say. So you just have to know, how do we create situations? How do we create situations that puts us in the best position? Don't come out and don't come out being like, I'm gonna be angry, I'm gonna treat you mean, unless that's part of your strategy. If it's part of your strategy, then do it. If you have a purpose for it, then do it. If it's not part of your strategy, don't do it. That'd be my number 2 thing, since we're running a long time. Number 1 thing for strategy for any act like this: if you have not talked about why you should do it, it should be taken out of the affirmative. If you do not have a justification for it, period. I don't care how good it sounds, do not read it. Take it out of the act, because look, read a 6-minute act with the stuff you want to say instead of reading a 9-minute act with 3 minutes of stuff you don't need to say, because that 3 minutes will end your debate.
We got a couple other questions I was going to throw out. So how is decolonization measured? Is it measured at all within the context of this affirmative? I would say my gut instinct is it's not really measured. Although, depending upon the position, so a lot of this is like, it depends on the position that you're taking, that you have in the world, and the position that you're taking in the 1AC. But some of it may just be, like Ben said, straightforward. If the AF is like, okay, our goal is decolonialism or decolonization and abolition and or ending the world. In that case, it's like decolonization is pretty easy to measure because it's distance from where we are to the end of the world, if that makes sense. In another context, it might be consent or level of consent. And this gets back to the point that Jasmine made at the very beginning, like much earlier up in the chat. It may be that you can say, well, decolonization looks like, for example, Black women having the agency to choose. And to the extent that that agency is foreclosed in this debate, decolonization has been blocked or prevented. So it's not really like a quantitative way of measuring anything, but it's a way of saying, like, for yourself, okay, depending on, you know, who you are in the debate, my agency or their agency has been blocked and prevented from being activated. And that could be a way of measuring at least that colonization is occurring, and therefore that decolonization is not occurring, if that makes sense. Yeah, what do you think about that, Ben?
I say just impact turn it. You don't have to be like, don't be mean, but you don't have to be direct. Just say every time you ask me, I feel like I said this already. Every time you ask me for steps, every time, is you just being scared and you want to preserve something. The answer is no. You said above that you are a refusal. We refuse to answer questions that are wrapped up in white anxiety. We just not going to do it because it does not matter. It does not matter how we get there. The argument is, are you going with me or not? Right? Are you following me or am I running over you? Those are the 2 questions that matter. It does not matter whether or not you know whether we're going to use C4 or whatever else first, because that process is not it. Think about, and the other argument you can make, more offensive one that your evidence states, King says it's always a process when it comes to colonial visuality, right? It's a process. I think Sean said some of this earlier. It said its first thing they had to do was identify that the land was worth working, which indigenous folks have figured out. So they got indigenous folks to teach them how to do it. Then they killed them. Then they brought in a workforce that they did not identify. And every time there's a process, there's a next step that happens. But that step requires colonial visuality. It requires a violence and erasure of groups of people when we outline steps, because we have to say, we will conquer the Proud Boys first, or we will conquer the KKK first. And then that allows them to what? Both mobilize against us, right? Because it's probably that's probably the difference between strategy and tactics, right? Whether or not we want to tell you something matters, because from a strategic position, telling you might be good because we might get your support. Strategically telling you it might be bad because you might be with the Proud Boys of the KKK. So a tactical approach, which is what we would take, I think you can make this your argument too. A tactical approach to decolonization does not require that we are somehow transparent with how we deal politically. As far as you need to know, again, either you are part of the guerrilla warfare we're going to launch, or you are going to be a victim of it. I don't know if you want to say that. That might be a little aggressive. I don't know how deep y'all roll, but I tell mine to get in there and get it. You know what I'm saying? Well, woo, woo, get in line. That's all I'm gonna say. Get in line. All right, we should probably talk about framework a little bit because we haven't given framework any love.
Yeah, so really quickly,
Okay.
Sophia actually asked a good question about framework, which we can get to in just 1 second. But Tatiana asked, so the physical aspect is still technical. I think this is about affect, which is actually a really good question about affect. So the physical aspect is still technically considered psychological, but will eventually become physical if there is a radical curve. And then lower down. If so, how? And what does that look like through the counter narrative of the KF? Good question.
The short answer to that is I mean, this is so tricky because like dealing with if I ignore everything I know about anti-blackness theory, my answer to this question would be that the appeal of humanity was often found in Black people through the arts. So a lot of kind of pro-abolitionist movements that took place, people that wanted to free Black people, saw them as human, saw them as artists first that could establish something beautiful outside of just being Black. So that's an example of how affective relationships grow to create substantial change. And anyway, the other argument you can make that's just historically true, remember, because history matters, is law doesn't matter. What matters is public opinion.
Yeah.
Schools were desegregated, and folks lined up outside of the school with guns to prevent Black children from entering the school, right? But there had to be a public shift in perception of the inequity between Black and white races that took place. And that public shift is what ultimately led, even though there was like literal military intervention to get the children into the school, right? There still had to be a public kind of demand for it to happen. And we've seen this throughout several categories of different groups in the United States that proves the affect argument being effective, not to mention the numerous amount of kind of organizations and institutions that have started simply because of the affective connection or the appeal or how impressed someone was with certain groups of children that they didn't actually think could do the things that they did.
Well, and I would say too, just like take it back to the framework level or the interpersonal level, that sometimes, you know, the power of affect is you go in a room and you can sort of tell based on the vibes, like this person I sort of trust or the mood, and this person is kind of giving me like a bad, I'm getting a bad read from this person. Like something's off. And I think that's like the other element of this is like to the extent that the AF is about friendship and building decolonial relationships, interpersonal relationships, that like affect can play an important role there too, because it can tell you, okay, these are friendships that are true friendships, and these are alliances in the quote unquote sense that are negotiated, agreed upon settlements that have really toxic negative side effects, if that makes sense. So I thought Sophia's question was really good as a transition into framework stuff. How do you avoid going through the motions, and what makes an interesting framework debate? You want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, you know, this sounds really simple, but I really, as someone who judges a lot of framework debates, this is just like an endemic problem. Read the 1AC. Like, just like actually read through the whole thing. Not just, ideally, not even just the highlighted parts. Now, I realize like sometimes your prep time is really limited, but if you can, you know, when I was preparing to do this workshop with you all, after I got this email from Jasmine and Caitlin, I looked through the cards that Jasmine sent, and I was like, okay, I'm going to read as much of all of these cards as I can, including the unhighlighted parts. And I'm going to like sit and sort of think through some of the different interrelationships like that Ben and I have been talking about, and some of which Jasmine alluded to earlier in the chat as well. And just sort of sit with those for a while and think about like, okay, what is the AF saying about debate? What's the AF saying about interpersonal relationships? And what is the AF saying about the resolution? And where are there places in there that I could potentially push back against that? And where are there things that are going to be really difficult to refute, if that makes sense? if you are debating framework well, in my opinion, the way that people should think of framework is less as a disad and more as a critique, actually. And I say that you should think of it, I think of it as like a critique of reading the resolution and the reading practices that go into interpreting the resolution. So one element of this is the affirmative interested in counter-defining the resolution at all? And if they're not, then you can ask yourself, and this is the point I'm trying to make, sorry, before I get too deep into some of the details, is the affirmatives that are critical have had this like asymmetrical advantage for a long time because they're the only debaters in the debate thinking about the politics of reading and interpreting texts, if that makes sense. And a lot of time the negative team is just insisting that like words mean what they say, like Merriam-Webster is right about what all these words in the resolution mean. And that really puts you at like a huge disadvantage as a negative team because you're just imagining that what you have to say about the meaning of the words in the resolution is like basically apolitical and just like agreed upon by like a dictionary or like some like topic authors that someone put in like a file in your Dropbox, right? And if you start thinking about it as something that's political, the practice of reading the resolution is political, then you can get a lot more specific and detailed with what you're doing with framework as the block progresses. And you can get a lot better at choosing impact arguments that are not quite so easy for the affirmative to impact turn, if that makes sense. It's like this whole 1AC is about how debate has a broken alliance. And that Black folks in particular, also Indigenous folks, and especially Black women vis-a-vis King, are placed in this position where they, as Ben said earlier, the choice is foreclosed. They're just like, is not really choice. And placed in positions of violence where they're sort of, position, to just shortcut a little bit, positions of violence. If you as the neg come up and say, well, for fairness, that's not really going to get you very far, right? Because the assumption of the 1AC, the argument the 1AC is saying is at the most reductive, simplistic level, the world's not fair. It's actually really messed up and hierarchical, right? So if you say, oh, well, it's unfair that you like didn't agree to read the resolution the same way we did, that seems like a very petty form of unfairness in the face of the things that the AFF has described. Now, conversely, if you stand up and you say, you know, here are reasons why interpreting the resolution is important for creating radical friendship, which you in the 1AC have said is good, then you're going to get a lot further, right? So my impulse for framework is always to tell people, first, if you can, try an internal use framework as a critical reading practice. So the process of reading the resolution as a way of internal link turning the affirmatives, some part of the affirmative. Because the best harms to, or the best impact to have the framework is the 1AC's impact to the extent that you can access it. Because they can't disagree with that impact, they read it. So that's the easiest way to get yourself in a winning position in the debate. And in this particular debate, as we talked about earlier, the reason, one of the good things that came out of spending so much time unpacking the 1AC is that we already talked through the way that there's a complicated relationship between friendship and alliances. And that can be a place where the negative on framework could potentially get some traction in saying that we don't need to agree about what the words in the resolution mean. We don't need to agree about what the topic will look like, but we have to agree to disagree about what the resolution means in order to create some of these forms of radical friendship and to maybe ask some cross-text questions about what level of reciprocity does friendship involve, if that makes sense. Because that evidence at the end of the 1AC talks about how Belcourt and Roberts say, well, you know, we met at a time where we had collective, though uneven, exhaustion. So what Billy Ray Belcourt is saying there is, well, it may be true that I, speaking as the author, and Mara have uneven levels of exhaustion because we're differently positioned within the world, because one of us is a settler and one of us is indigenous, but there is still the possibility of reciprocal recognition of each other as both being exhausted. And it is possible to speak of something called collective exhaustion. Does that make sense? And those are the kind of rhetorical moments in affirmatives that you really have to pay attention to. So moments in the 1AC where there is reciprocity or there is the possibility of a collective language of suffering or of politics are things that you as the negative really have to be thinking about. Because if you want to be saying that there is some possibility of collective politics and there is some need for mutual recognition and mutual engagement. And if you don't have that, then you're stuck just saying like what I call the Willy Wonka tea argument, which is like, at the end of the old Willy Wonka movie where he goes, "You broke the rules." Like that's not going to win you the debate. You're just going to link to the F and you're going to get like a 26 and you're going to be sad. So you don't want to go Willy Wonka. You want to, like, as much as possible say, how can I try and take these rhetorical moments in the 1AC and make them a part of the way that I'm talking about reading the resolution and engaging it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think I just say it a little different. So I'm gonna say it a little different. One, stay in your competitive lane. Who are you when you debate? What type of persona do you embody? Right? Let's not try to act like you all go into debate rounds. You're the same person you are when you're in the hallways talking to your friends. You're not, right? If you are the person that simply wants to steamroll people, you want to read framework, you care less about what their AFF says whatsoever because it doesn't say plain text, so you can't read whatever DH scenario you want to read. That's okay. Be that person. You don't have to be mean when you're that person, but understanding if you're that person is kind of the first step to being successful. Most people don't want to be that person. Most people want to be more of a chameleon. What I mean by that is you say one interpretation in your first speech, but by the time we get to the 2NR, you have changed into so many different things, trying to be whatever the AFF is also trying to be, that you probably end up losing the debate. Because the same arguments you're making for why Stacey's point is good is the reason why you cannot continually change your counter interpretation like they changed their interpretation. So my suggestion would be stay in your competitive lane. Know who you are. All right. Never, ever, ever fold. Never fold. Always be ready to check your opponent. If that means that they're talking about some complex theory you do not understand, then guess what? You'd be like, oh my gosh, that was all really interesting. What did that have to do with alliances again? Right, nothing, right? Okay, I just want to make sure that you're still talking about a topic that has nothing to do with the resolution. You need a defense of your theory of power. Why are you right? Why are you right that simulating games or that role-playing situations or that that debating about whatever does anything good? You need evidence. Your evidence has to say why debating about this topic as students is good. Your evidence has to say why debating about this topic is critical for special interest groups. Your evidence has to say why debating in and of itself leads to the necessary skills for you to be able to later advocate or be the ally or friend they mentioned in the 1AC. That friend ain't got no skills. And if they did, the person they talking about in the story was a debater. Look at Caitlin. Debater. Right? Proves my argument. Debate is good because it teaches you the skills you need to be the ally. All your allies don't get skills. That's why they let you get cussed out by all kind of people. We here now, we know how to talk to them. We know how to talk to them in Capitol Hill. We know how to talk to them on Forest Hill, wherever they at. Yes. Jasmine, stopping me. I have one more thing to say. I'm not allowed to say it.
Oh. I was asking a question to that. I was asking.
Okay.
This is me as a student, as a
here we go.
debater in the background. Just like you were my judge.
Yeah, I was. That's true.
Yeah, it did happen. It went down many times.
I voted for you plenty too.
Yeah, and there were the ones that hurt, but there were a few that hurt. There were a few that hurt. But we're here, and I clearly very smart, very a lot of good thoughts. I had a question though I think a lot of folks when they're debating framework, right, and they're trying to kind of resolve what to do with like the procedural limits portion of the debate, or trying to decide. Do I go the counter interpretation route, or if I'm doing this kind of counter model stuff, how much time does a strategic 2A with like the vision of the 2AR? have to spend trying to put defense to these debates, right? That we don't explode debate enough, but at the same time, we don't care. But at the same time, the negative is going to use all those arguments to kind of box out why the AFF can't be evaluated and justification for whatever, the TVA or switch side, whatever the debate is, right? So what are your kind of recommendations for a 2A that's kind of staring at that debate in the face and it's like, what is the decision that I make? How am I orienting myself? How do I not get lost in that stuff, to be honest, right? Like, how do we not get lost in trying to keep up to pace with someone who's like, I learned this phrase thanks to Julian, doc-botting the debate, where it's just a whole bunch of cards, a whole bunch of words, a whole bunch of things. How do you stay in that debate and not trap yourself because you're trying to kind of meet some of maybe the counterpretation doesn't explode limits, we're doing all this interesting stuff? What are your recommendations there?
I can go. So what I would do for teams, 2 ACs and how much time you spend on them is impossible for us to give you a model that works like for everybody. So what you have to do is do the things that makes giving a 2 AC easier. All right. Number one thing is you have to know your prep sheet. Do not prep judges that lean away from your ability to just go for the impact turn. Because really, I would say the best strategy for answering framework is just impact turning that the game is good at all, that there's no value to the game, that even if you blow it up, that's good because all your education is trash anyway. It's been trash. At least, and listen, but we're not just going to blow it up. Here's a counter model, but the problem with that counter model is inconsistent with all of our other telos arguments, which provides a little bit of friction. Most judges may not catch that, but I think an easy get around for that kind of friction thing is that, listen, we're not saying at the end of the day, this is how debate has to look. We are saying that this is how we are engaged. This is what we are currently doing, right? That is good, that destabilizes debate. That does not mean debate ends with this vision. If other people want to engage this particular model, they can engage that model, but this does not, because we're not attempting to rebuild debate. Does that make sense? Like that's not what we're doing. Instead, we are building allyships and friendships based on current understandings of how we can position ourselves against the world, which is a prerequisite to any of your nonsense about we need plans and steps and blueprints because you're not you're not part of the friendship.
Question to that then, so like we don't get the judge, right? That this is me completely
Okay.
with you. Like we don't get
Okay.
the judge that leans
Right.
towards the impact turn because we saw the Northwestern sheet. It was hard. To do those prefs, to get just the judges that will vote for that. So let's say we're now in the like 45 to 55 percentile of prep, but hey.
Yeah, I hear you. No, I hear you.
So with that exact part, so the counter model portion where it's like that might add some tension. What is it? So the counter, the tension. And like the part that the negative does really, really well at, right? And I think it's because it exploits what weak 2AC arguments are built to answer. And that is, how is the affirmative evaluated, right? In ways that do not require either A, competition, or B, do not disprove the entire thing of what the affirmative is trying to destabilize, to be radical towards. And I think that those judges, where you can't go for the impact turn and just be like, destabilization good, your education is bad, and they're gonna like listen to that debate and be like, yes, Sway. So like, how does the affirmative not require some of those things? What is the kind of maneuver that the affirmative has to kind of figure out so that that judge doesn't just kind of tick the box and be like, you're right about a lot of your stuff, but that's low-key the reason why I'm going negative, because you don't have that then AFF framing argument that kind of puts all this together. If that judge even buys that, right, that at least comes close to kind of ticking those boxes for them, if that question made sense to you all. For everybody too. This is, once again, I don't debate. All I do is coach and judge. So like, hopefully that question in and of itself made some sense, right? Just like the debate has to be evaluated. Does the affirmative require that evaluation that is compatible with maybe a competition frame? But does that necessarily contradict some of the parts of the earlier portions of the affirmative? And does that contradiction put the affirmative in a kind of hard place when a judge is trying to understand the kind of competing model of debate that the affirmative says is their engagement, and why that is not exclusive, or why the negative model would be exclusive to the affirmative. As a recap. Sorry, but that was
I think those are two different. I think those are two different questions.
How? I just added in, so maybe I added in the negative portion. That was just like
Yeah. See, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I added
Those are
in
two
like
different questions.
into the negative, right? Why does the negative not solve that? Fine, I added that part in, but the first part was pretty consistent. Both questions, real 2AC things.
Well, I guess really quickly, I think it does depend a little bit on the affirmative you're reading. Some teams' affirmatives, I think, can, and I've coached some teams who did a little bit more of this stuff, can say, we're going to counter-interpret words in the resolution differently than any of the policy literature does. I remember there was an AF that a Wake team was reading. I think it was Wake. It was definitely a team that Amber was coaching. Was reading that in the 2AC was redefining climate and reading these like Christina Sharp cards to do that on the emissions topic. And that like got them some traction. So you can, if you are a team that is going to counter-interpret the words in the resolution in some like from a critical perspective, which I think can be a really effective strategy if you have the horses to do that and if it works with your affirmative, then I think you should say, basically, their understanding of the words in the resolution is articulated from a violent, colonial, white, etc. perspective. Our reading of them is better from this other perspective, and then maybe read a card or so, just maybe one card in that 2AC to go with your definitions. That's about why resistive readings or readings against the grain or something like that is good. And I actually think that's really tough for the negative to answer, because then you're saying, well, we are interpreting the words in the resolution and we're interpreting them in a way that's more politically productive than you are. So I think that can really work. Now, if you can't do that, and a lot of times that's the case, that you don't care to do that, or you're not doing that. I think the big framing thing that you want to do as the affirmative, and this, Ben might disagree with this for sure. With this affirmative, a piece of this, if you're debating in front of a like 55th percentile judge who's like kind of a policy person, I would say the way that you want to do that is to impact turn all of the stuff that the affirmative or the negative has said about like decision-making skills, argumentative refinement, that kind of thing, deliberation, and say fairness, but all of those things are artifacts of a form of liberalism that the affirmative is criticizing. And I'm thinking particularly in this AF that, let me get the author name right, just so for the purposes of these spars. King 16 actually, I think is a little better on that point, I believe. I could be wrong. Is it King 16, Jasmine? That's the one that talks about the human and bound. No, King 19, the first card. My bad. King 19 is really good on that. So like if you think about it as the AF team, this sometimes goes by the wayside because the negative team will like change what impact frame they use. They'll say one debate, they'll say deliberation skills. The next debate, they'll say argument refinement or informational refinement. And you're like, are these the same thing or are they different? I think a lot of these things reduce to basically the same thing. And they're basically just saying like, you've got to get better, that debating the resolution means that you learn to get better at processing information and sorting it. Now, what a lot of AF teams, I think, don't appreciate when they're reading, especially stuff like King that's in the anti-Blackness literature, those people are all critical of especially liberalism, but also like, and Ben and Jasmine may laugh at this, but also neoliberalism, to be honest, because that's what that is. That's like the whole purpose of debate is like workplace training so that you can like go out and become a better like kind of like activist in the sense of almost in the sense of like accruing human capital and like getting likes on Twitter, if that makes sense. And if you're AF, you got to be like, no, like that is not the point of this affirmative, to get better at like getting a job or to get better at like getting the people we disagree with to like us, right? So a big part of this is just saying, look, decision-making, deliberation, all this stuff. Why do we care about that? And they'll say, well, maybe they'll say, well, it's important for going out of the debate and becoming an activist, or going out of the debate and becoming a policymaker, or going out of the debate and getting a job, doing this thing. And you want to say, okay, first of all, why is the first thing that you all want to do to get out of the debate and to talk about what will happen after the debate? With this 1AC, you've already criticized that. And you've said, no, we need to talk about what's happening in the debate, interpersonally, in the like fleshy interactions between the debaters as the round is happening. So that's one impact turn, is like the get out of the debate part, or the moving out of debate, like export model part. And the second part is to say, why is the goal of critical scholarship to get better at sorting information? Doesn't that assume that sorting information is a neutral thing? And isn't our King 19 evidence saying that the whole idea of neutral skill building in the academy is itself a problem? Does that make sense? You read all this stuff critical of universities, and then the negative basically read like a university mission statement and was like, we want scholars that are critically engaged in their communities and are able to sort information. You as the affirmative have to be like, that discourse is the like neoliberal discourse of universities and skill building, and that's bad. And if you do that effectively, even judges who are more policy oriented will vote affirmative, because they will process that as like a negative critique, if that makes sense. And that's I think is a little bit easier for people to follow. Or at least they'll vote affirmative because the negative doesn't have an impact. They'll just be like, I don't know what the neg's impact is by the end of the debate. You want a critique of it, negative has no impact, I vote affirmative. Which I vote on that as a judge. I wouldn't put myself in that category as a judge, but I vote on those arguments a lot, on just like the neg has no impact. I voted AF.
Only thing I would add to that is I don't think it's smart for teams that read critical affirmatives to try to card for card debaters. Therefore, I think it's silly to engage in the interpretation debate. You will not win it. Your interpretation will often not be from the same kind of lit base as theirs, and most judges are more familiar and comfortable with theirs. And interpretations really don't matter if you don't have an impact. So I say the time spent should, one, it depends on whether or not they're answering your argument or not. Remember, I've talked about performance a couple of times in this debate. I think you can tie performance theory to a specific disad of why their model is problematic and does not allow for any type of engagement for Black people. Here are a few examples that you can use. The first one is bad interpretations or bad TVAs. Several teams will make TVAs that are not actually topical. They just insert random special interest group word into doing this action, and they say this is topical. You could have done this. That's particularly problematic, right? Like, it literally means that they believe that it's a one-size-fit-all category for all forms of Blackness, and they think all Blackness is the same too, which in and of itself is pathologizing, and you should impact out that argument as well. The second one is how they interact with you. And remember, I believe it was Astor that said we can just stand up and be mean to them. Don't have to talk to them, be friendly. They only think you're going to be that way, which means they're also going to posture to be that way back. There's a fine line to walk to being non-Black, reading framework in a way that just doesn't feel racist to everyone in the room. And I would say 70% of debaters haven't conquered it yet. They still look pretty racist when they read framework against non-white teams. And some of that is because it's kind of uncomfortable to tell someone that just stood up and said, from my perspective, it's more than likely that I'll be killed because of the color of my skin, my sexual orientation, or my ascribed gender. And it's a hard conversation to have, so we should capitalize on that. When you're giving a 2AC, a 1AR, and a 2AR, you have to always use your uniqueness argument that you have first, right? Your uniqueness argument is the fact that debate is currently racist, sexist, homophobic, and ableist. It's just a bad place to be, if we're perfectly honest. Regardless of the benefits that you get from participating in competition, debate is bad. The reason you want to make that top level claim that debate is bad and it is dying is because regardless of what interpretations they have of how good the resolution is, if you can win a larger claim that the institution is dead and it's bad, then it's much easier for you to win that impact level of the debate than to trying to win by the specific iterations of role playing in the context of this framework is bad, right? So skinny it down to a specific kind of performance argument that you can make that specifically attacks their argument. The last thing is make sure that you're identifying why your model, right, checks those things. How does your model deal with the forms of debate that are bad now that their model perpetuates. So if their model is performatively anti-Black, or performatively anti-queer, or performatively homophobic, right? How do we kind of check that? What does our model do? Which again, this probably becomes more of a distinction between why you are having a debate, why you're participating in debate, more than it does your actual vision of what debate is, right? Because I think you can effectively say, listen, we are here to disrupt on purpose. Whenever we see instances of colonial visualization, which would be the way that you perform against us, we are here to disrupt that. That doesn't mean that everyone has to actively do the same thing we do, because remember, you're trying to avoid this whole, everybody has to do a telos, argument, I guess. Which means that's how I would set it up if I was you as far as time allocation. Start with your offensive uniqueness claim in the debate community. How does kind of the affirmative deal with that and bring not only it to light or to acknowledgement, but also deals with that particular issue through a disrupting of colonial violence? Then go directly into impact turning, why their form of education is bad, why scenario planning is problematic, how it always assumes or maps over certain bodies that are never counted in the actual cost of the move itself, how the framework debate requires a process of step making to get to the end goal, which we're impact turning to. If they don't have offense to why their education is good, if they don't have offense to why we should care about their feelings and their anxieties, we win the debate. Like, I don't know how else to say it in a more succinct way. It may sound mean. It's not meant to sound mean. It's just you have to eliminate all potential avenues they have to receive sympathy. The reason you lose debate votes is the reason you lose debate rounds is because you have not convinced the judge that the violence you were talking about is something they should care about yet. It's plain and simple. They would rather preserve their job judging debates than to say, well, the tradition of debate is broken now because policy debate is just bad. You have to make them believe that policy debate is so problematic that they have to vote against it, which should be easy because it's practice for being negative. You literally just make a bunch of your framework arguments when you're negative about why debate is bad. All of those arguments translate into when they read a plan text, while the AFF is bad too, which for the 1AR should be a breeze, right? Because that's all your 2NC, 2NR arguments anyway, on the framework debate at least. All of the reasons why debate are problematic is anti-Black. It holds up the university industrial complex. It maintains kind of the idea of good versus bad academic worker. All those are arguments against their model. Why are we worrying about their interpretations? That don't make sense. Just answer their model. Impact on it.
Yeah, it is really weird that people get so sucked on the rabbit hole of interpretations when they're saying like we should end the world. Like, well, the interim's definitely in the world. So. Right.
Like, what are we talking about?
No.
Don't get I tell my students this all the time. I do. Debate is built to be an efficient machine for policy arguments, because policy arguments, traditional policy arguments, especially if you talk about things like the politics this ad, does not require an in-depth analysis. It is literally a rumor mill, right? Which means that people can make really quick, blippy arguments, and to justify them, they need the buzzwords that judges already know to assign to that argument to give it its validation.
Yeah.
You're working from the other direction. They don't believe that Black life equals oppression. They don't believe that gender oppression exists. Or at least that's what you should start assuming when you're in the 45th to 55th percentile. If that's true, then how do we compensate for them? There's a great example in this professional development series I did with this organization where I forced all of them to watch like different Netflix documentaries. And there were folks that didn't even understand that people were being prevented from voting in the county next to them. When you disrupt your judge's idea of justice is when you win the debate. You have to make them believe that there's a lack of justice for the special interest group you identify in the 1AC. And you do that through impact calculus. That's why there's a moment in the 1AC that says this debate is really about materiality. What does it mean when we talk about what an alliance means for Black women? What does that actually mean? When has that happened in a way that has not opened Black women up to more forms of violence, exclusion, embarrassment? Right? If that's true, why aren't we talking about that? Why would we want to align ourselves with the debate community? Real quick, debate community. Let's identify some black women that y'all held up. I'm waiting. Still waiting. It ain't happened, right? So that should be our response, our attitude, right? Our posture towards a question of framework. This is a question of, do I trust you? And sorry, boo-boo, I do not trust you. Do not, at all. I had to throw that trust this ad in there, y'all. I'm telling you, it's going to get you some W's in places you're not expecting to get them. They're not going to be ready for it because they up here making arguments. Guess what? I don't trust the judge either. I don't know you. You was in my 55th percentile. So I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but I'm going to tell you why I'm right anyway. This is all the people you're going to make sure to continue to exclude. Look at all these programs that have all these black debaters out of that quit because the school they go to, their coaches won't coach them. They debate in districts where the judges automatically vote them down because they walk in the room, ain't even heard their argument yet. We ain't got to we don't have to make it up stuff to win. They doing racist stuff every day. The uniqueness argument for racism been high. It ain't coming down. It ain't trending down. No. 2020 is going to last another 50 years, I promise you. I'm sorry. I don't mean to get all going on you. Because I got out, y'all. I made it to Canada. No, let me stop.
It's free. It's like, yes, where?
I got out. I got out.
Awesome. Oh my goodness. I don't want to cut anybody off. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. Yo, sorry. You.
All I was going to say really quickly was there was a question like way earlier back in the chat that Aster asked about how does that type of reciprocity not link back to the academic alliance, which I think is a really good question. RE, the point that I was making earlier about trying to identify moments of reciprocity in the 1AC, I think that's a great point. And I think Ben just explained how you can make that link argument work and impact turn the negatives attempts at reciprocity. And at the same time, the only point I was trying to make is you have to be really careful about what you're saying in your 1AC. And that's why a smart negative team should be looking for those claims already in the AF. And why an AF has to be really careful about what they're saying. Because like if they just say, well, you should be reciprocal with us and you didn't say any of that, then like that's not persuasive. If you said something in your 1AC and they say, well, we're agreeing with this moment in the 1AC, then that is more persuasive, I think, for the negative, to agree with something the 1AC already said. So that comes back to the question we had at the very beginning about what is the 1AC stance on friendship versus alliances? Sorry, that's the only thing I was trying to say to answer that question.
Just real quick, I know y'all got to go. If you're negative, make sure you talk about kind of anti-blackness. What you want to do when you're negative, when you're reading framework, is you want as much as possible to get the AF to define their concept of anti-blackness or whatever their theory of power is. And the reason why is it is easy to identify structural barriers that exist towards that particular group that you can tie to policy-oriented arguments. So like they don't remove this particular law. They don't engage this particular law. They don't engage the state in this way. That's problematic because the state is still giving them. That's still a good argument to make. It's not the most powerful argument, but it's still a good argument. An argument you definitely have to make on framework, I think, in order to make sure that you're effective is you want to make sure that you have the double bind argument that is in there already. It's just functionally like, either it's a game that they want to play, which means you have to use an objective standard to be able to decide who wins the debate, or they don't care and you can vote neg on presumption. I just think that's like a true debate argument you can make. It's like if either they want to win too, and they have to provide us with a way to be able to do that. And if they can't do it, their answer is going to just be that is a form of colonial visuality, or that is a form of kind of telos-based politics, and all of that is bad. And your argument would be, no, this is not a question of politics, but it's really a question of gaming. And I think there's a substantial difference in like how we set up rules to play games versus how we engage people politically, right? The distinction, obviously, being that like politics really impact lives directly, whereas games are something that we can come and play to, that we can have objective standards, that everyone having access to the game will have equal kind of opportunity to participate. And I think a game versus politics distinction is probably necessary. Avoid as much as possible, I would say, and I know a lot of people might think this is counter pedagogical, but avoid using too much of their language if you don't know the literature. Use the language that you understand, try to get them to define the rest, and then lean heavily on probably testing as a way to counteract some of the offense, because you're just not going to answer their arguments because you don't understand it. Stick to your game. Same way when they're AF, they should just talk about their AF and include your negative arguments every now and then. You should do the same thing when you're neg. Talk about your negative position, include the AF every now and then sprinkle in some TVAs if that's the direction you're going. But I think the much smarter thing is just to go for the game is good. We should work to preserve the game. You make the game impossible to play. We don't solve anything outside of this round. We're not activists. We're probably bad people. That's fine. We just want to play a game. Playing the game is good. I think that's the hardest framework to answer if you read a critical AF, because low key, you're just trying to play the game too. So, I mean, you are like, so if they avoid all the politics stuff, a lot of your offense might get shaky, is all I'm saying. All right, that's all I got. Sorry.
Oh, and to end on a statement that I agree, Ben. I agree. Kinda, sorta.
You're funny.
No, I'm super happy, appreciative for both of you giving your time to talk on this. I hope that y'all received some good information, some good thoughts, that some questions of yours were resolved, and that you take a lot of this when you're preparing your 2 ACs, 2 NCs, 1 NCs, 1 ARs, 2 ARs in tournaments to mean something. And that's not just like the round, but it's also what's going to happen now, right? Everyone got that email. Everyone knows they're going to do a rebuttal. But what we're doing, we're going to do a slight kind of adjustment just because y'all had several questions, which I love. I think that's more kind of valuable than us just kind of projecting things that we think are good recommends to your learning. Your questions are your actual where you're at and what you need to grow to learn. Is that Caitlin is going to give a 2 and R. To a presumed 1 AR that shall state kind of what were the arguments. Please write those down / listen. What then will happen is that you will be in charge of giving a 2 AR. A lot of the recommendations that Ben and Sean gave were all helpful, every single one, for kind of putting together what your speech will be. Is everyone here giving like a affirmative rebuttal? Is that me assuming? Who am I assuming? Is everyone on the critical affirmative side of things? That's my question. Who is not? Who is like, are you not? Who is, Brandon?
I'm pretty sure there's a few,
Okay.
at least a few.
I have to go put my son to bed,
Okay.
so
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'll let y'all later. If y'all are still on and doing things, I will definitely come back. I have some time tonight.
Yes.
But I have to go do bath
Go
time and stuff right now.
Go be a dad.
Right.
Go be a parent. Don't know that life. Wait, so maybe my question was confusing. So who here is like negative? Who's like wanting to be framework? Okay, so I assumed correctly, right? That everyone is here to kind of debate against framework. That is my, all right. So just, all right, sorry. I make life way too confusing than it needs to be. This is if you want to. I would love for everyone to, this is if you want to. I am not forcing any person who is above the age of 2 to do anything that they don't want to do. Sorry if you are below the age of 2, that's just tough luck. It's just because you don't know how to live your life without someone holding you and carrying you in life. So this is up to you to decide if you want to engage in doing a 2 AR to Caitlin's 2 and R. You'll be responsible for flowing the 2 and R, and then what we'll do is we'll split you off into some breakout rooms, and you will give the 2 AR speech to that 2 and R. Use the things that you were, given advice for in conversation with Ben and Sean, and use your own things. None of these should sound like stock 2 ARs. I think that everyone has a different spin or way in which they engage kind of argumentation. Y'all all also occupy different identity positions. So that's definitely going to affect the way in which you defend the affirmative. And so think about that. I think that I think that there are strategic elements for any of these things, but just think through what the workshop was. I would say, I'm going to give you some preparation time to get ready for the 2, but no, debate, it's here we go. So we're going to do it. So Caitlin, are you good? That made sense. Well, sorry, are there any questions to this model? Caitlin's going to give a 2 and R. You are going to give a 2 AR. You are flowing to give a 2 AR. And those who want to give a speech will then tell me so that we can watch those. Does that make sense? Everyone track that? All right.
I will say I literally just typed out the 2NR and sent it just because my voice is a little rough today, and I don't think I could get through a full 6 minutes because I spent all night yelling at my cat because he woke us up at 2:30 a.m. by knocking all of our plants over. So I apologize on that end that I cannot read, but I'm typing out everything as much as possible. So sorry for that little hiccup, if that's okay. I can read for a couple minutes or slowly, but.
Live a rest, your comfort, your body, so you know. Please don't hurt yourself. Oh, someone's trying to join real quick, sorry. Okay. Then wait, talk Tiana.
And feel free to embellish any of these 1AR arguments for your 2AR. I just want to set the foundation for you all for the core arguments I set up the 2NR to respond to, because obviously both the AF and the negative are approaching this from different kind of angles. The negative is just like debate doesn't have the capacity to have conversations on interpersonal relationships. Therefore, we should default to this model of engagement, where the AF is just like, no, we have the capacity for it. So think about it in that way of how this 1AR and 2NR are approaching the conversation for your 2AR. And I tried to incorporate all the major themes that Sean and Ben discussed throughout this. And please, Sean, feel free to add anything if I missed any major strokes or anything.
No, this is great.
So flow, you know, don't just like stare at the computer, you know, definitely flow. I will be a stickler about that. Flow.
Have them side by side. The old Scott Phillips way or the Alderete way, where they'd have you show your flows after every speech, be like, is everything lined up? Yeah, it definitely extends an explicit answer to the TVA. It's just up to you how you want to word that given the arguments that are there.
So I'll give you all about, let's say 5 minutes. Is that fair? No? Is 5 minutes not fair? How do y'all feel about 5? Whoever's ready in 5, that's who we'll take, and that's who Sean will watch give some rebuttals. Who's ready in 5? Excellent.